Hi, I'm Melanie Ann Phillips, co-creator of the Dramatica theory of story. And in this episode of Beyond Dramatica, we're going to have the second installment in our mini-series, Secrets of the Quad. Now, in the first installment, we covered a lot of ground, so I'll recap it here for a minute or two in case you haven't seen that, and then get on to the new material. To begin with, the quad itself is represented by this periodic table of story elements in Dramatica. You can see at the top there are 4 basic units: universe, physics, mind, and psychology. These 4 units work together as a family. On the top, universe and physics are external. On the bottom, mind and psychology are internal. But physics and psychology are processes where universe and mind are states. In other words, universe is the external fixed situation in which one finds oneself in a story. Mind is the mindset or attitude, the fixed state of mind. Physics are the activities that are gone through in the story to try to resolve the situation, and psychology are the manners of thinking with which the characters must grapple in order to arrive at the proper solution. Together, then, universe, physics, mind, and psychology make a quad, and underneath them they can be subdivided into smaller quads, or smaller groups of families. For example, under universe, although you can't see it here, universe is made up of past, present, future, and progress. And directly under universe in this corner is past. While similarly down here in mind, it's made up of memory, consciousness, pre-consciousness, and subconscious. These are the same items, equivalently to mind, as the ones that are beneath universe are to universe. So for example, past is to universe as memory is to mind. Now you can see that even those are further subdivided in the third level into smaller families of 4, smaller quads, and then even smaller quads at the bottom that are constituted of the basic elements of story structure. Now what are these elements? Well, the mind is a machine made of time, and every single element that is in the dramatic structure represents a process in the mind. It is not an object, but it's treated like an object, like programmers do in object-oriented programming in software, where basically you have a process, and if you're going to be using it as a component of building a larger process, perhaps over and over again in other areas, you treat it as an object, and then you bring them together as modules and use these processes to build larger processes, which can then be treated as objects in their own right and put together to create even larger, more complex processes. And that's exactly what this chart indicates, is what are the processes available, but not how they necessarily go together. Well, that's pretty much the concept that we had at the beginning, and we covered a little more detail about the ins and outs. But before we go into the more specific understandings and the logic of why it all works, it's really important at this time to get a sense of how it all works, almost like a feel for it, or if you're a fan of Robert Heinlein, to grok what the quad is before we try to explain the inner workings of it. So, to that end, we're going to be talking today about not only our logical understanding, but also the way a quad feels, so you can identify it and identify what needs to go into it. And also in terms of what makes sense in a quad versus what its overall mood is, the mood of a quad. Well, it turns out that if we look at our reason and our emotions, and our logic and our feelings, those actually make a quad by themselves. And here it is. This is the basic form of a quad: reason, emotion, logic, and feelings. Well, what's the difference between reason and logic? Well, for Dramatica purposes, reason is like the end product of logic. It's like reason is what makes sense. When people say, oh, that makes sense, even though they haven't stopped to figure it out, that doesn't mean that they are using logic. It just means it strikes them as making sense. You see, in the mind we have something called spatial summation and temporal summation. Spatial summation is when the mind gets kind of a photographic look at something and sees the entire pattern at once. Temporal summation is when the mind builds something up over time, step by step, like a story being told. An author is going to look at a finished story with spatial summation and say, here's my story, here are all the pieces in it, this is what sense it makes. But the audience is going to be receiving the story through temporal summation and building it up piece by piece until they arrive at that same view that the author has. So in a sense, you can find out what's reasonable if you use your logic to get there by step determining what makes sense. But you can also have a sense of reason that you didn't need to do anything to get to that point. It just struck you that way. And then if you wanted, you could use logic to deconstruct it and see why it makes sense. So the two are related, but they're not the same. And similarly, at the bottom level, feelings and emotions. Emotions are a state of things. They're like your mood. Like in electronics, they have a DC offset, which basically says before you even put an amplitude wave or anything moving along the course of an electronic circuit, is it offset to be a higher or lower voltage? Well, when you're in a depressed mood, you're at a lower voltage. When you're in a higher mood, a happier mood, you're elevated up. So your mood is kind of the background against which your feelings play. And they have the same relationship, your feelings and emotion, as logic and reason. Some things you just go, I'm just in this mood. I don't understand why. I just am, okay? You don't have to necessarily feel your way to have a mood. But you could say, well, I feel about this and I feel about that this way, and this strikes me like that, and this makes this sense in my feelings, a sense of feeling, okay? And ultimately, through all those feelings, I arrive at, I really don't like this situation. On the other hand, you might start with a basic mood and say, I'm in a terrible mood or a really happy mood today. Why? Well, because I feel this way about this, and the light's coming in the window a certain way, and it reminds me of my childhood, and I have these feelings about the job I'm going to be doing today, and it makes me happy, for example. And so you can deconstruct your emotions with your feelings. But although they are related, where you can make emotions from feelings and make feelings from emotion, they aren't the same thing. These are fixed states. And they aren't really fixed because they do change in time. What makes sense now may not make sense later as you gather more information. And what feels right now, or what your mood is now, may not be the same later because of different experiences. But compared to logic and feeling, that are the real swift-moving processes of the mind, it's like real short-wave stuff and real long-wave stuff. So if you look at reason from logic, reason appears to be unchanging. This is what makes sense. Now, what logic can I put in there to understand it or to carry it further? So it seems as if this is stopped. Similarly, emotion itself is a state. This is my mood. Maybe I'll be over it by the afternoon, maybe after lunch, but right now this is the mood I'm in. But feelings, they can play against that, a positive or negative thing, a specific flavor of feeling, happiness, sadness, jealousy, envy. These things can play against an overall mood. Now, we saw in the first episode that those kinds of relationships where things could affect one another, reason, do my emotions make sense? Emotion, does this thing that makes sense feel right? Okay, and how you can try to understand your feelings by applying logic to your feelings, or see, if you like, where your logic is headed. Okay, all of these interact in a family. And in the first installment, we talked about this relationship as being the same as, in the external universe, mass and energy and space and time. Again, this is kind of fixed. It's a magnitude of difference in detail or frequency from what happens in this line. And so you look at mass and energy, and they seem pretty straightforward, pretty fixed. Sure, they can transmute one to another in terms of a nuclear explosion or nuclear fusion, for example, E equals mc squared. But when that happens, it requires a huge amount of force to change it quickly. Just like your mood could change almost instantly if you found out that a valued friend had died or that you won the lotto, okay? Something with big impact can change it, but under normal circumstances, not special circumstances, these things appear to be pretty much fixed relative to the speed at which these work. Similarly, space is always evolving, becoming a different arrangement of pieces of mass being acted on by forces of energy. And time is constantly progressing so that it is moving forward through time, and you can look backward to see where it came from, but it's a constantly changing thing. So while mass and energy appear to be relatively stable, space and time appear to be constantly evolving and changing. Well, we also found out that inside the mind, we can find those same four dimensions: knowledge, thought, ability, and desire. Similarly, Mass and knowledge are kind of the same, just like reason is kind of the same. Knowledge is the fixed state of things in the mind. It's what we know. It's the particles that we say we expect these things to hold, to be true, to be relatively set in place. Something can change our knowledge by throwing things into a new context, but again, it takes a lot of force to make that happen all at once. If our knowledge base does change, we're not going to say, oh, the world is flat, now the world is round every single moment. Instead, we're going to be gradually adjusting our knowledge until it is evolved into something, but it appears relative to the desirability of doing things, which is constantly in flux. Whether we like something or not, how much, what we should be interested in, what we are interested in, and our abilities. Can we do this? Are we able to do that? Those things are constantly moving as quickly as logic and feelings do relative to reason and emotion. So thought and knowledge, thought works like energy and mass. Thought is the energy of the mind, and it can rearrange knowledge the same way energy can rearrange mass. It can be attached to knowledge the same way you would attach energy, kinetic energy, to a billiard ball. But just as ability is kind of what you know in the middle of what you don't know, space is kind of like the different pieces of mass in the middle of where there is no mass. And time progresses forward, and desire is always looking at the way things were compared to the way things are compared to the way they might be. So we begin to get a sense here of these items, how there's a fixed relationship, something that's going to stay long wave and relatively stable in each case. And similarly over here, there's something that's constantly in flux. Logic and feeling and ability and desire constantly changing, and space and time. And similarly, just like there's a space-time continuum, desirability is also a continuum, where when we have a zero desire, it doesn't matter how much ability we have, we're not interested. When we have a zero ability, it doesn't matter how much desire we have, we're not going to act because we know we have no ability. Logic and feeling are the same way, that we logic our feelings and feeling our logic. And if it doesn't make any sense at all in our logic, it doesn't matter how much we feel it's good, we won't think it's the right thing to do. And similarly, no matter how strongly our feelings point in that direction, if it doesn't make any sense, then we have trouble following those feelings. That's why a lot of stories are about trust your feelings or go with your heart. Or if your heart says this, sometimes you have to step back and say, does that really make sense? What's better in the long run? What's better logically? Well, the final item I want to talk about in this installment is the Dramatica chart again, which had those items at the top: universe and physics and mind and psychology. Physics and psychology. And they have the exact same relationship once again. The universe is the fixed state of things externally. It's the situation. Mind is the fixed state of mind. And although they can be changed by a huge explosion or by some sort of a news that changes one's mind dramatically, an epiphany, for example, physics is the process or activity that's constantly in flux that is working to rearrange the universe. And psychology is the mental process that's working to rearrange your mind. But you can have a mindset without having done any thinking about it. And similarly, you can dissect or look at the smaller components of a mindset by breaking it apart using your thoughts, saying, why do I have this attitude? How is it that I came to this point of view? And similarly, physics can be used to say, why is the situation like this? Why are things not moving? What are the things that are resistances that are holding things in place? And so, for this installment of Secrets of the Quad, we see we've made another quad right here. We've got a quad of our logic and our feelings, our reason, our emotion, our universe, physics, mind, and psychology, mass, energy, space, and time, and knowledge, thought, ability, and desire. Now, I'm not saying these are in exactly the right places in this larger quad, but they are the components. A good exercise would be, if these are the subfamilies, where would each subfamily go to have the same relationships that each item has in the smaller quads that we've dealt with today? So, that's the end of this installment. We'll be back in just a little bit with episode 3 of Secrets of the Quad. In the meantime, please visit us at storymind.com for all things having to do with story creation, and dramaticapedia.com for all things Dramatica theory.